Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on FRA compliance for railway contractors. For those of you that don't know about Spark TS, we specialize in especially FRA regulations. We have RailTasker and PeopleTasker, which is our software to help companies manage all of these requirements. We happen to also be a third-party administrator, and our roots are back in the training space, right? We have a library of online courses and approved checklists for Part 243. And before we get too far started, I just want to mention our next webinar is going to be on November 5th. Holly Rainwater is going to be hosting that. That's been a series, so if you've missed the other two, you definitely can find those on our website, but this is going to be part 3 of mastering your DER role, and she's going to be focused on test exceptions. And then today, this is fun. This is the first time all 3 of us have done a webinar together. My name's Katie Inoue. I'm the CEO and founder of Spark TS. Holly Rainwater is here. She's our VP of Drug and Alcohol Testing Programs. And then Paul Rogalski, who is our Vice President of Operations. I think many of you know us. If you don't, we all come with a railroad regulatory background. We've all worked at railroads, Class 1 railroads. I worked in regulatory affairs. Paul was responsible for Part 243, instructional design. And of course, Holly's been a DER and I worked at TPAs as well. Let's see. Today, we're going to focus, when we think about railroad compliance for contractors, and I have a lot of blogs written on our website. Holly's written a lot of blogs too. When Part 243 was going into effect, I was really focusing, there's a handful of blogs we've written on contractors because so many questions were coming in from, in fact, I had a Class 1 railroad give my cell phone out, so I was getting 10 to 20 calls a day for a while back when 243 was going into effect. But lots of resources there. We're going to start by looking at the drug and alcohol requirements in Part 219, and then we'll move on to Part 243. And under that umbrella, want to talk a little bit about roadway worker contractor compliance because Part 214 has some unique requirements. We are not going to necessarily focus on the risk reduction rule. That's something, if you are a railroad that falls under it, whether you're a Class 1 railroad or maybe you're in the program for other reasons, maybe volunteering to be in the risk reduction rule, that has some contractor requirements we're not going to talk about necessarily. That would be based on your plan. And of course, whenever you have contractors doing work for you, if they're doing regulatory inspections for Part 213, or if they're doing mechanical work under the mechanical regulations or signal work, obviously those technical regulations apply. We're going to focus more on the people management side. On the panel, there's a spot to ask questions. We'll definitely be keeping an eye out for any questions. Feel free. We've got, I think between the 3 of us, we should be able to do our best in answering questions. If there's something that comes up, we all work very closely with the FRA and we can find out information and get back to you as well. And I think I mentioned the registration link for the next webinar is in the chat. I'll be focused on the question pane more than the chat, but yes, we can go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with you, Holly.
Great. Thank you, Katie. We'll be talking about Part 219, and if you're not familiar with those numbers or that regulation, 219 is the FRA drug and alcohol testing rules. The railroad, or the FRA, excuse me, does tell us and gives railroads responsibilities. Contractors must be notified of their responsibilities under the regulation. They must obtain and confirm they are compliant before they perform regulated service, and you must do your due diligence to ensure that you receive summary data to show compliance. And we'll break those down a little bit as we move along. But as railroads, you are responsible to ensure those things happen. The next slide actually shows us in the regulation where you can find that. If you look at 219.9, scroll on down to contractor compliance, it is right in the regulation. It says the responsibility for compliance must be spelled out in the contract between the railroad and either entity or in another document. The absence of a clear delineation of responsibility, the FRA may hold the railroad and another joint or entity jointly and severely liable for compliance. It's a lot of responsibility to put back on the railroad's plate. But there are some things that can be done in advance to help manage that compliance. I'm going to quickly just bring in who is covered under this regulation. When we talk about the regulation for drug and alcohol, it's very close to the 243 regulation. I think it's got a little bit of a couple differences. But under this regulation, it's anyone who performs hours of service, train engine employees, mechanical hostlers, signal maintainers, dispatchers. It can be any of those people. It can be someone who performs roadway worker functions, so your maintenance away employees. And then it's also someone who performs mechanical instruction or mechanical testing and inspections as defined in Part 219. We're looking at then 219 goes into 215, 211, 229, 230, 232, and 238. Lots of different areas where the regulation can make one of your employees a regulated employee.
I just wanted to say, with the addition of mechanical employees, the one thing that I think is just to note is it's really the same set of employees that need the Part 243 requirements. It's hard to think of an example of somebody that would fall under one and not the other. They need Part 219, they're going to need Part 243 and vice versa.
Exactly. With that being said, with the railroad, with a regulated employee, some of the things that you're going to need are contractor acknowledgments of Part 219. You'll want to be able to show that you've completed your employee training under 219. There is a requirement for employee training. Supervisor training under 219. There's also required testing that you need to do. There's FRA post-accident testing, where that's the blood tubes and you're going to the hospital to do the drug testing in the event of a significant rail event, as defined by 219. Reasonable suspicion testing, so that's where you are at work and suspect someone could be under the influence of drug or alcohol while they're working. Reasonable cause testing, random testing, and pre-employment testing. You will also need to do 40.25s on all of your employees and ensure that you're following Part 40. Part 40 is the regulation that oversees all of drug and alcohol testing, but it also includes where if you have someone who tests positive, they need to go through subpart O, that's your return to duty testing. And then you go into your operations test and you need to do an appropriate number of Rule G observations on your employees.
Holly, to clarify, you're talking about the contractors acknowledging they're doing these items for their own employees, and the railroad's responsibility is just to document that acknowledgement. Is that right?
Yes, and the railroad may be liable if they could go in and audit. They should be looking at those to verify that those things are completed. That's correct. Another thing that's recommended, the FRA states that every 6 months you should submit a report to the railroad that shows your statistical summary. What this is doing, and this is with your FRA testing. So what you're going to want to go ahead and put on here is all the types of testing that you've done and break out alcohol and drug. And then you're going to put how many tests you completed, how many were negative, how many tested positive for one or more drugs, and then what those drugs were. And then with alcohol, where they fell, whether it was below a 0.019, a 0.02, or a 0.04 in those areas. It's going to ask you to complete all of that. And as a railroad, that's a way to go in and say, okay, John's Contractor says they have 200 employees, but they only did 10 randoms. I think there's a problem. Just taking a look at this MIS report is a huge help to your railroads to help verify compliance.
I'm just curious. Also, for the MIS report, the contractor does it for all of their employees, regardless of what property they're on, just any covered employee, or is it specific for the contractor?
If they're all in one, then it could be for all of the railroads that they're working for. I think for the most part, it's very difficult because contractors can maybe move from railroad to railroad. It would be very difficult to manage if they're working for one place or another. Another part besides the MIS information is your plan. The FRA is the only DOT mode that requires you to get approval for a random drug and alcohol testing policy. The FRA actually has put together 3 different model plans that they require that you utilize when submitting and creating your railroad or contractor drug and alcohol policy. Now, when I was with the railroad, I had many contractors send in their company policy or their FMCSA policy or their transit policy to me. But you need to send in specific policy in regards to the contractor plan under the FRA. The FRA actually does have on their website, these plans has a lot of information that you can utilize. If you give this plan to your employees, that actually does help constitute for education because they do have all the requirements for the training requirements that you need. But you will need to get this approved before you actually can draw your randoms. And all of your employees should have their pre-employment test, their 40.25, like I said, before they come on property.
Another question for you. We have a lot of contractors that work with us who are really small, and there is some smaller employer railroad exceptions. Would they be able to fall under those exceptions, or do they need, I see there's a specific plan just for contractors.
Yeah, there's a contractor plan, and in the plan, if you are a contractor doing work for a small railroad, then you're falling under a different, you wouldn't be required to do the random testing, but you fall into that contractor when you are doing it for a full compliance railroad. The minute you go onto a class 1, you need to go ahead and then now you become covered under the random plan, but you still are required to do the pre-employment testing, the cost testing.
And the small, it's a fairly small railroad might still have to do the randoms, right? The small exception is for really small railroads. I'm just curious, out of all the plans, because you look at a lot of plans, how many plans, what percentage of plans do you think when you're seeing contractor plans are accurate or good?
The plans that come my way?
Yeah.
The ones that I have seen, I've probably seen more bad ones or incorrect ones than correct better. I would say
template, they could be fine.
If you use a template, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. If you don't use a template, the FRA will come back and just tear that policy apart. Yeah, don't send them your company plan. Don't send them something you put together with legal. Go in, take that compliance contractor plan and just create that. Everything's there that you need.
Does the railroad, they just need an acknowledgement of them being compliant. They don't need a copy of the plan, correct?
They have to approve that. A great way to do that is provide a copy of your approval letter from the FRA.
All right, that is, anything else for part 219 before we switch gears?
The only other thing I can think of, Katie, is to just remind people, if you have less than 4 people, you need to be in a consortium. Then you can work with a TPA like ourselves or other TPAs out there and go into a consortium where you're with other employers. Then you will meet the random requirements. If you've got 3 people, you cannot be in your own pool. Once you hit that 4, you can be, but you can look at a consortium.
I think the other thing just with contractors is the rule Gs. We talk about rule Gs, the observation that employees are not displaying signs and symptoms. I think that's something when I talk to contractors that they don't necessarily are always doing. I'd say I find more often than not that's something they're not doing. Just want to mention that too. All right, Paul, part 243.
All right, thank you. As Katie and Holly said, many of the same people that are covered under the 219 plan are going to be covered under your 243 plan. Under 243, they are defined as safety-related railroad employees. So you'll see that term, or it's how they define people. Again, generally hours of service, anybody that works in and around the tracks, operates maintenance away equipment, things like that. Generally the same people that are involved in your 219 plan are required to be trained under 243. Hopefully everybody's familiar with the 243 regulation by now. It's a training regulation for safety related railroad employees, but specifically talking about contractors, what a railroad is responsible for with the contractors. Again, you have to notify your contractors in advance of their responsibilities. You have to obtain confirmation they're compliant before they perform regulated service. Again, you have to verify that they are in compliance with 243 before they're allowed to work on your property. You also have to maintain a list of the contractors used. It has to have their name, business and email addresses, and primary telephone numbers. And you're required to regularly update this list. And you also have to keep that. You can't remove anybody from that list of contractors until 3 years after the last calendar year that you use that contractor. It's important to keep that up to date. I know there's services out there, I think Katie or Holly mentioned earlier, like IS, to help railroads do that. They keep track of all the documents. They make sure that everybody has the paperwork in that they need. The part of 243 that requires this, you see there, .101F, railroad that chooses to utilize contractor employees to perform safety-related duties and relies on contractor-provided training as a basis for those employees' qualification to perform those duties shall retain a document from the contractor indicating that the contractor's program was approved by FRA. A copy of the document required, paragraph E of the section, which talks about the contractors, we'll see that here in just a second, satisfies this requirement.
I just wanted to emphasize or mention something about that specific paragraph, because there's a proposed amendment. When we get the final rule for Part 243, this paragraph is going to change slightly, indicating the contractor's program was approved by FRA. That isn't necessarily always the case. That's a regulatory requirement. That's out of sync with the actual compliance guide of Part 243 for those of you that might be aware that like pages 8 through 11 in the compliance guide list items that don't need FRA approval, and that is also true for contractors as well. I just wanted to clarify that the contractor doesn't necessarily need the program approved. It depends on what they're doing.
Yeah. And for those of you, if you don't have a copy of the compliance guide, if you go on the 243 portal, you can get a copy of the compliance guide there. And it lists out, like Katie mentioned, on pages 8 through 11, it lists specific parts that require training, but you don't have to submit those and get approval from the FRA. You just have to have a program in place for those different parts. All right, the contractor's responsibilities under 243. Contractors have to be in full compliance with the regulation. Any work that you do that falls under 243, or any of your employees that do work that fall under the 243 requirements, you have to be in full compliance as far as training, OJT, refresher training, things like that. You have to qualify your safety-related railroad employees. That's the training, OJT, that type of training. You do have to complete periodic oversight. Periodic oversight is, some people call it operational testing. There's different terms for it, but it's similar to if you have a 217 plan, you can roll the 243 periodic oversight into your 217 plan. 243 specifies 3 specific areas though that they want you to do the operational testing on, and that's parts 214, 218, and 220. Specifically for 243, you have to do operational testing or periodic oversight for those 3 regulations to satisfy 243. There are some exceptions, like I said, for contractors with less than 15 employees. If you have less than 15 employees, if you directly train your own employees and you do not employ, or yeah, less than 15 employees, train your own employees and do not have a supervisor that's trained to perform periodic oversight, then you're not required to do periodic oversight on your employees. Did I get that right, or did I mix that up?
No, you have it right. However, the regulation, FRA, we're talking from FRA's lens.
From FRA standpoint, yeah.
There are definitely exceptions for contractors with less than 15 employees, and there's supervisors that would have the ability to do that periodic oversight or operations testing. However, I have not seen this in practice at all. The railroads consistently have contracted this responsibility back to the contractor. FRA says it's not required. Contractors, we work with a lot of contractors and a lot of railroads. Contractors, at the end of the day, their customers are the railroads, and it's just very likely that they're going to be the one doing that periodic oversight. At the same time, I know, and I've heard FRA, Rob and I have spoken together on this regulation more than once, and I've talked to Rob more than once, or the F243 team at FRA. And I know their view is, while it's the contractor's responsibility, likely contractually and just by regulation, that they're doing periodic oversight, FRA does feel like if there's an accident incident that something happens and they do an investigation, there's some sense of liability that they're going to put on the railroad for making sure that they're managing their contractors and ensuring they're compliant. A slippery slope, but Holly was talking about in part 219, the railroads have a responsibility to audit contractor compliance. They get that report every 6 months, but then Holly, you alluded to that they should be auditing for other drug and alcohol requirements under part 219, like the training and so forth. With part 243, I always advise or give best practices that the same is true. I would approach it similarly, where you do some form of checking in with your contractors to make sure that they're continually compliant. And when you get, I'll just pause there for a second. The best practice, I feel like FRA is somewhat expecting that at some level. Not something you would get hit on in an audit, but if there is an investigation for any reason, I think they would be really glad to see it, and it would help you out. You would not be disappointed that you did it. Operations testing on your contractors is also something that you don't have to have it in your plan. I wouldn't put it in your plan actually, but would be also a good best practice. And I think something that FRA is. Paul, anything else you can think of on that piece?
I believe in the compliance guide, it does say that railroads aren't required to, but there's nothing stopping them from doing operational testing on contractors as well. Even if it's not, like Katie said, don't put it in your plan, but there's nothing stopping you from doing an operational test. And I think it even specifically says that if you see a contractor performing an unsafe act, you're supposed to report that to the contractor, to the employer of that contractor. Yeah.
Yeah, that is required. No, but they have spoken publicly otherwise. There's always a little bit of that. The other thing here is it talks about providing the contracted program was approved by FRA. Again, I'll just call this out. This is where the regulatory language is different than the compliance guide. There is a proposed rule making out pending, and we're at the point where we're just waiting for the final rule. And there'll be a handful of changes in part 243 when that final rule is published. One of them is to align it to the compliance guides. If you're a maintenance and wave contractor, a lot of you are on the call. If you you don't need to have a training program approved. If you're a mechanical contractor, and we have a handful of our clients who are, a lot of times those are the programs that do require a submission. And then we could just throw up, because I think there's a couple Signal folks. Signal right now did require a submission with the pending Signal certification. That is going to change under part 243, and we can talk briefly at the end of this webinar a little bit about Signal certification and dispatcher certification at a high level. But just a confirmation that the contractor is compliant with part 243, and Holly had it listed out of possible things that they need to be compliant. I would get from your contractors, or as a contractor, be proactive and say, I'm compliant with part 243 and qualifying my safety related employees. And I would also call out on the job training and periodic oversight. Soapbox. All right, I might have jumped ahead on some of the common questions because these are things that we get asked a lot, but I'll let you keep going, Paul.
Okay, yeah, the only other thing on that previous slide was that as a contractor, you are not required to do an annual review of your program. So the difference between an annual review and periodic oversight is ongoing throughout the year. An annual review of the training is where you go in and you look at incidents, accidents, FRA reports, things like that to figure out how your refresher training, they want you to use it for your refresher training when that comes up every 3 years or every 1 year, whatever the frequency is for that refresher training. But as a contractor, you're not required to do that annual review of your program.
And you had a good call out. If a railroad sees a contractor doing something unsafe, they are required to notify the contractor of that incident, one of their employees. And then they also aren't required to do an annual review, but the railroad is responsible. If you, for example, change your on-track safety program, you are required to notify your contractors of the changes that impact them. All right, now to the common questions.
All right, yeah, maybe Katie can help me with some of these here. We can tag team some of these questions, but like she said, these are some common questions that we've had in the past about contractors and being in compliance. The first one there, do you need to provide the railroad a copy of the FRA approval letter for each course? the way it's written now, you don't. You just have to provide a document saying that you're in compliance. I know some railroads want to see that FRA approval letter. If you're training in-house and you have submitted a program, you're not adopting a model program, for instance, or you're not using a training institution or a training center or learning institution, they're probably going to want to see that FRA approval letter. Since it's your program, they're going to want proof from the FRA that your program is approved.
And for the short lines on the call, you don't need these approval letters unless you want to just be above and beyond the requirements. And contractors, I tell them you can mention it. I wrote a blog on it, and a lot of times it just is easier to provide those approval letters. And I'll just jump ahead, Paul, and the same is true if they're taking, you talked about in-house training, but if they're taking like one of our courses or another course, you don't need an approval letter. So the TOLI is the training organization or learning institute, I think, something like that. If you're taking an approved course as a contractor, sometimes it's nice, our approval letters are all in the training space as a handout, so it's really easy. You can download those and send them if needed. They're all on the FRA portal for any model program. Same requirements, they don't have to do that. The last bullet is a little tricky. Do you want me to just tackle that one? If a contractor provides documentation to a railroad that their training is compliant and later FRA determines the contractor is not compliant, will the railroad be held responsible? Some of these slides, honestly, we've done this before, and I might have had this with Corey or Rob where I'm asking FRA this question. Normally I'll put myself on the hot seat. Normally I put them on the hot seat. In theory, no, but the FRA talks a lot about that. In general, they expect these railroads to take some extra precautions in managing contractors. And so that's where I think some of the best practices of doing a little bit of ops testing on your contractors, doing some good faith audit, making sure that when they're doing an affirmation that they're compliant with Part 243, you're calling out on the job training, periodic oversight, and not just a lot of them I see are like, I'm compliant with Part 243 and leave it at that. But it's not as black and white, to be honest. And we have had a lot of fatalities in the last couple of years with roadway maintenance machines, and a lot of them have involved contractors. FRA has definitely investigated both the contractor and the railroad for each of those incidents. And we just talked a little bit about this.
Yep.
I think, well, it's the same thing, right? But it's not the railroad's job to actually do the training, maintain the training records. It is the employer's job. That is the contractor. They're the ones doing that. I would just call it out and have the contractor affirm they're qualifying their employees under Part 243, including providing on-the-job training when required. Paul, you talked a little bit about periodic oversight. I think we can skip that one. Some of these slides are definitely from when I spoke with FRA, because we can definitely talk about it though. So how will FRA be enforcing Part 243? I can take this too, unless you want to grab it, Paul.
I can answer, but yeah, go ahead. If enforcing Part 243, I know they're in the process of doing audits of the 243 programs now. They'll be going through and they'll be auditing. They'll be looking to make sure you're following the plan that you submitted. If you said that we're training all of our carmen on these courses and they're getting this OJT, they're going to want to see those courses, see that OJT, they're going to want to see training records. Basically, the FRA team, the 243 team, is going to be making sure you're following your plan and you're doing everything you're saying you're doing in your plan. The local inspectors are going to be the ones that are actually looking to make sure that people are doing the job safely, they're following your procedures, they're almost like periodic oversight. It'll be from the FRA side. They'll be looking at supervisors and be looking at workers on the ground, similar to any other FRA inspector that comes out to your property.
Yeah, the local inspectors definitely can ask for training records and say, I want to see how you trained your track inspectors in Part 213 and make sure their training is up to date. We didn't talk about refresher training, but right under Part 243, they need to have refresher training on Part 213. So the local inspectors can definitely be asking about training records. They shouldn't be auditing, to your point, about the training plan. Now, FRA right now is auditing the Class 1s, but I don't think they have any intention as of recent to audit most of you on the call. So I'll know certainly you're going to get your certification audit, every 2 to 3 years. Part 219, Holly, it's probably every 3 years, right? 2 to 3 years.
Mhm.
Part 243 isn't on an audit cycle for the short lines and contractors. They have done the audits like Paul talked about for the class ones. But if every accident investigation or incident investigation is 243 is included. They're going to be a little bit more reactive for a lot of you, but it's one of those things that could change. The 243 team on FRA is fairly small, and one of them is moving to signal certifications. I think actually that move, it was October, so it probably has already come into effect. So there's only 2 of them right now that I'm aware of. I don't know, but that's their current plan. All right, maintenance away.
Yeah,
So
did you want to?
Yeah,
Okay.
I guess with roadway workers,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. The first question's a little bit. We do need to qualify our roadway workers. Part 214, we have a slide. We'll talk a little bit about how it has to be host railroad specific. You guys painfully know that, those of you that are contractors. If you're a basic roadway worker and you're just doing on-the-job training, you're not throwing a switch, handling the derail, using a radio, it's possible you can be trained with a classroom or online course and no on-the-job training. But the second you do something else, handling the switch is under Part 218, OJT is going to be required, and to be a machine operator requires on-the-job training, or any of those other duties under Part 214, like watchman lookout, lone worker, roadway worker in charge, and so forth. Flagman. I always avoid saying that, being from Minnesota. Let's see. If a contractor performs track repair and the railroad puts the track back into service, I get this question a lot actually. Like, I see a lot of contractors with Part 213 in their training plans. Paul, what do you say about that third question?
I believe to put the track back into service, you have to be designated by the railroad, by the owner of the track, correct?
Yeah,
So
the railroad's handling all of that, and the
it's
contractor.
handling all of that part, yeah. But if you're doing, I'm trying to.
Yeah, and it's a little bit sticky. You could make a case that you
Yeah.
still know track safety standards. However, I guess when you were at a class 1, if you had a track maintenance company, were you looking for Part 213 training? Probably just Part 214 would be my guess.
Part 214, because it was on us to make sure that the track was up to standards, make sure it was inspected before putting back into service, making sure it met all those requirements. Our track inspectors had to be 213 qualified. We didn't expect that from the contractors because we weren't going to expect them to put the track back into service.
Exactly. And you worked at a class 1, certainly like these contractors, sure, you should understand the track safety standards in Part 213 to do the track work and do it to a good standard. But when we talk about Part 243, it's the minimum training standards. It's what are you required to do from FRA's perspective? And this one, I think we can carve out and say the contractor is not going to do that. And I'm going to save that. We have a slide on the next slide on 214 stuff. Some new stuff here. We're almost to the end, and then we'll definitely take any questions. Paul, I know you've been involved with this too. Do you want to summarize some of it?
Okay, Katie has worked with the ASLRA and come up with a supplemental training for roadway worker protection. It's the annual training that's required for RWPs, and since it has to be railroad specific, they've worked to get this basically a template where you can go to a railroad and say, okay, we need your specific plan, but it lays out the training and it shows you exactly what you need from the railroad for each railroad to get this annual training to make sure that you're staying in compliance and you're getting that annual refresher training that's required from each railroad. And like it says there at the bottom, it allows contractors who need multiple road worker protection courses to take one core course and then get this job aid for each railroad down the road. So you don't have to do a full course every year for each railroad.
Yeah, this is actually really exciting. I see some holding companies on the webinar today, as well as some of our contractors. I'll just pick on our contractors. If you're a contractor and you work with 8 different customers, you can train your employees on a core roadway worker protection course. You can take Spark's course that's approved by FRA, and then have a job aid for each host railroad. Now, this project, something that is myself, JR, short lines, and FRA work done, and Paul's been in the background helping me too on it, is that we all came to an agreement with FRA on here's the items that are in that supplemental training. Part 214, what is it I need to know going from property to property that's different? A lot of it is red zone or work zone procedures, speeds. A lot of it is RMM stuff, to be honest, roadway maintenance machine stuff, but also lone worker procedures. It is literally just a handout, and if you're a short line member, that handout's available on their website. I think they put it under Part 214 under their compliance templates. Some of you may not be a member of the ASLRA because it was something I've been working on for several years. We have a version of it as well. So this is one of those exceptions. You don't have to be a member. It was something that Spark and the ASLRA did together. And a lot of times, you guys all know I might work with the ASLRA under their umbrella, but this is unique because we do have a handful of customers who aren't members. You can take advantage of this. I would say you would keep it like a training record. And for, again, speaking to the customers on the call, like you can use your learning management system, put it in there, have the employee acknowledge it, and have it as simple as that. No more having to take a whole bunch of different roadway worker protection courses every year. Obviously, you said it too, Paul, but if you're a roadway worker in charge or a lone worker on the job training, and also more robust knowledge trainings required. And like we said before, no OJT for roadway workers, but RMM operators, watchmen, lookouts, and flagmen still need on the job training, which is what JR would say, a once and done, right? You initially do it. So this job aid I'm really excited about. For those of you who are short lines on here, why you might want to care is I would recommend use that template and provide it to your contractors. We were just talking about doing due diligence, making sure that they're really compliant. Unfortunately, we've had half a dozen or so fatalities with roadway workers, a lot of them being the majority contractors. Here's something you can do to make sure your contractors know the specific operating rules that are unique to your property. And this would be a great time to take a proactive stance in getting that information out. I guess that is all I have. Any questions for us? If you email the info@sparkts.net, we can make sure that it gets to the right person. Although our emails are not so difficult, it's either Paul, Holly, or Katie at sparkts.net. We're happy to answer any questions. Holly, anything you can think of as we close for Part 219?
Well, the only thing I could really think of is that if there is an incident, the FRA will come. I know that I've been in the past had a contractor fatality actually, and the FRA did come and they did ask, what do you have for this person under their drug and alcohol program? Be prepared because it will happen.
Paul, anything you have?
Just the one thing Katie mentioned real briefly, we didn't put it in here about refresher training. 243 does require refresher training at least every 3 years, unless there's a more restrictive refresher training required by a specific part, like for instance, the 214 at the RWP is every year. We do have approved refresher training checklists now that you can adopt. They're all in the FRA portal. If you're interested in looking at any of those, we worked with the FRA, we got them approved. There are objectives and there's time frames. It's a mix of a course and hands-on to satisfy the refresher training need. We have those for several areas if you're interested in those.
Yeah, that's a good point. Paul worked on getting those approved. I had picked at FRA for a few years so that we could do that. You can use Railtasker for those checklists. I mentioned briefly the new certification rules coming down. Paul and I did a webinar on that. We plan to do another one. We just are waiting for a little bit more clarity from FRA. We shared the basics, but we're waiting for a little more clarity from FRA and some of the questions that industry has asked on the new requirements. They're unique, especially for the signal certification. If you haven't dug into those new requirements for the railroads on the call, the FRA, the way the regulation's written, you're actually required to maintain the documentation and the certifications for your contractors. So that's a very different take than what has been done previously. Part 219 you need just from your contractors, you need to maintain that contractor list and the affirmation and audits that they're compliant. You're not maintaining their records. Same thing with Part 243. We just got done explaining that the new signal certification is quite a bit different. If you are a short line, and a lot of short lines, a majority of the short lines who have signals outsource that. Just be aware of that. We'll host another webinar when FRA is ready to be put on the hot seat on some of those questions and get those answers to you all. And we have some thoughts already on how our clients can use Railtasker to manage that, whether you're a railroad or a contractor. And we are working with several in the industry to make that as easy as possible. Stay tuned for that. But I don't know anything else on the certification stuff coming down. Paul, I think that's dispatcher signal certification. The compliance date will be March there are compliant requirements in March of next year, regardless of your size, but the plan isn't required until November. So just keep that on your radar. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next webinar.